The night sky over Delhi hung heavy with smoke and fear. It was late December in 1299, and something unprecedented was happening just beyond the northern walls of the city. On the ramparts, soldiers stared into the darkness, their hands trembling on their spears. What they saw made their blood run cold. Stretching from horizon to horizon, thousands upon thousands of campfires flickered like a constellation that had fallen to earth. The Mongols had arrived. A mother pulled her child close as the boy pointed toward the distant flames. His innocent voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Who are they, mother?" She couldn't answer. Her throat had closed with terror, because everyone in Delhi knew exactly who they were. The Mongols. The word itself was a curse, a prayer, a death sentence, all rolled into one. For 70 years, no army on earth had been able to stop them, from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna, from the frozen steppes of Russia to the deserts of Persia. The Mongol Empire had crushed everything in its path. Baghdad, the jewel of Islamic civilization, had burned for weeks. The libraries that held the knowledge of centuries were thrown into the Tigris River. The water ran black with ink. Historians estimate that 40 million people died under the hooves of Mongols. Entire nations simply ceased to exist. The Khwarezmian Empire, once mighty and proud, was erased so completely that today most people have never even heard of it. In Europe, the rumor of Mongol scouts sent kings fleeing and peasants praying. When the Mongols destroyed a Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohi in 1241, it wasn't even close. 65,000 European knights and soldiers were slaughtered in a single afternoon. The Mongols lost about 200 men, and now they were here, just 10 kilometers from the heart of Delhi, the greatest city in India. 10 kilometers. That's roughly 6 miles for those of you keeping track. That's the distance between downtown Manhattan and LaGuardia Airport, or between the White House and Bethesda. It's nothing. It's a morning ride on horseback. Inside the palace, Sultan Alauddin Khalji stood before a map, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. His generals surrounded him, their faces pale. Outside the windows, they could hear the city descending into chaos. Refugees from the Punjab were streaming through the gates, bringing tales of horror. Villages burned to ash, men impaled on stakes, women and children taken as slaves. The marketplaces were emptying as merchants fled. The price of grain had tripled in a week. The temples and mosques were packed with people praying for deliverance. But here's the question I want you to think about as we dive into this story. Could Delhi survive what no other city had survived? Would the unstoppable force of the Mongol Empire finally meet an immovable object? Or would Delhi become just another name on the endless list of cities that had fallen before the Mongol hordes? I'm not going to tell you the answer yet, because the real story, the human story of courage, tragedy, and brutal choices, is far more interesting than any simple victory or defeat. Before we get there, though, before we stand on that battlefield and watch what happens when two great armies collide, we need to understand who these people were and why this moment mattered so much. So, let me take you back 70 years to where this all began, to a man who would change the world forever and set in motion the events that would bring his armies to the gates of Delhi. His name was Temujin, but history knows him as Genghis Khan. In 1206, he unified the Mongol tribes under his banner and began a conquest that would dwarf anything Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar ever accomplished. But here's what most people don't understand about Genghis Khan. He wasn't just a brutal warlord who succeeded through mindless violence. He was a military genius who revolutionized warfare. His innovations are still studied in military academies today. The Mongol army wasn't just an army. It was a machine of terrifying efficiency and innovation. Every soldier was a cavalryman who could ride for days without rest. They could sleep in the saddle and shoot arrows backward at full gallop. They used a decimal system of organization. Groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 allowed for rapid communication and flexible tactics. They employed scouts and spies extensively. They gathered intelligence months before attacking. They used flags and torches for signaling across vast distances. Masters of psychological warfare, they spread terror through massacres. Many cities surrendered without a fight, but their most devastating tactic, the one that destroyed army after army, was something called a feigned retreat. Let me explain this because it's going to be crucial to understanding what happens later at the Battle of Kili. Imagine you're a medieval commander. You've arrayed your army in battle formation, shields locked, spears ready. The Mongols attack your position, a furious charge of screaming horsemen. You brace for impact, but then suddenly, the Mongols break off. They're retreating, running away. Your men start cheering. Victory. Chase them down. Kill the cowards. So you do. Your soldiers break formation and pursue the fleeing Mongols. And that's exactly what they wanted, because the Mongols weren't actually retreating. They were drawing you away from your defensive position, stretching out your forces, breaking your formation. Then, when you're tired and scattered and far from safety, the Mongol cavalry that was hidden on your flanks comes thundering in from both sides. Suddenly, you're not chasing defeated enemies. You're surrounded. You're going to die. This tactic worked against the Chinese dynasties. It worked against the Islamic empires of Central Asia. It worked against the Europeans in Poland and Hungary. It was simple, brutal, and almost impossible to counter, even when you knew it was coming. Because in the chaos of battle, when you see your enemy running, every instinct screams at you to chase them down. By the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, his empire stretched from Korea to the Caspian Sea, but his descendants had even bigger ambitions. The Mongols conquered the Jin dynasty in China by 1234. They destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate and burned Baghdad in 1258. They invaded Europe, terrifying kings and peasants alike. But then something interesting happened. In the 1260s, the Mongol Empire fractured into 4 separate khanates, each ruled by descendants of Genghis Khan, but functioning independently. There was the Yuan dynasty in China and Mongolia, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, the Golden Horde in Russia and Eastern Europe, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. It's this last one, the Chagatai Khanate, that concerns our story. Look at a map, and you'll see the problem immediately. The Chagatai Khanate was surrounded on 3 sides by other Mongol powers. To the west was the Golden Horde, to the southwest was the Ilkhanate, and to the east was the Yuan dynasty. If the Chagatai Khan wanted to expand his territory, he couldn't attack his fellow Mongols without starting a civil war that would destroy everyone involved. So where could he expand? There was only one direction left, south, toward India. By the late 13th century, the Chagatai Khanate was ruled by a man named Due Khan. The historical sources describe him as ambitious, cunning, and hungry for glory. He looked at India and saw an opportunity. The land was rich beyond imagination, overflowing with gold, spices, silk, and precious stones. The various kingdoms and sultanates were divided, constantly fighting among each other. And most importantly, they had never faced the full might of a Mongol invasion. Sure, there had been border raids, skirmishes in the Punjab, and probing attacks that had been beaten back. But a real invasion, a full-scale conquest attempt with total commitment of resources and the best Mongol generals, had never happened. Due Khan decided it was time, but he wasn't going to lead this invasion himself. He was going to send someone even more important, his son, Kutluk Khwaja. Kutluk knew this wasn't going to be a raid for plunder. This was going to be a conquest, a campaign to add India to the Mongol Empire permanently. And standing in their way was a man who was just as ambitious, just as ruthless, and just as willing to do whatever it took to win. His name was Alauddin Khalji, and he became Sultan of Delhi in 1296 through one of the most cold-blooded acts of betrayal in Indian history. His uncle, Alauddin Khalji, was the previous sultan. Alauddin was his nephew and a trusted general. One day, Alauddin invited his uncle to a feast to celebrate a recent military victory. When Alauddin arrived, Alauddin had him murdered right there at the banquet table. Then Alauddin rode to Delhi, killed anyone who might object to his rule, and declared himself sultan. Now I know what you're thinking. This guy sounds like a monster, and you're not wrong. Alauddin was brutal, paranoid, and absolutely ruthless in eliminating anyone he perceived as a threat. He banned alcohol throughout his realm, not for religious reasons, but because he believed drunken nobles were more likely to plot against him. He created an extensive spy network to report on potential conspirators. He controlled grain prices so strictly that he could afford to maintain a massive standing army. He was not a nice man by any stretch of the imagination. But here's the thing, and this is where history gets complicated. Alauddin Khalji was also a military genius and perhaps the greatest offender India had ever seen. He understood that the Mongol threat was existential. If Delhi fell, if the Mongol Empire conquered India, it would mean the end of everything he had built and the deaths of millions of people. So Alauddin did something revolutionary. He created India's first large-scale professional standing army. Before him, Indian rulers relied on feudal levies, troops provided by nobles who might or might not show up when called. Alauddin said no more of that. He paid soldiers directly from the royal treasury, roughly 234 tanka per year for a cavalry soldier with one horse, and an additional 78 tanka if they maintained 2 horses. That doesn't sound like much until you realize he was maintaining 475,000 cavalry, according to the historian Farishta. Even if that number is exaggerated, we're still talking about an army of staggering size. He implemented the dog system, which involved branding horses to prevent soldiers from borrowing horses only during inspections. He created the Julia system, detailed written descriptions of every soldier to prevent fake soldiers from collecting pay. He made sure his troops were well equipped with the best weapons available. Swords forged in Damascus, composite bows that could punch through armor, war elephants that could break cavalry charges, catapults for siege warfare. He trained his generals relentlessly and promoted based on merit rather than noble birth. In other words, Alauddin turned the Delhi Sultanate into a war machine specifically designed to fight the Mongols. And he was going to need every bit of that preparation because the Mongols had already been testing Delhi's defenses. In 1296 and 1297, Mongol forces had raided across the border into the Punjab. They had been defeated, but only barely. And everyone knew these were just probing attacks, testing the strength of Delhi's response, gathering intelligence for the real invasion that was coming. Now, before we go any further, if you're enjoying the story, do me a favor and hit that like button. It actually helps more than you might think with the algorithm. And it lets me know that you want more deep dives into forgotten battles and historical what-ifs. And definitely subscribe because we got so many more incredible stories like this one coming up. All right, back to the story. The man who led Delhi's defense in those early border skirmishes was a general named Zafar Khan. This is where our story gets really interesting because Zafar Khan is one of history's forgotten heroes. A man whose bravery was so extraordinary that it should have made him a legend, but who was instead erased from the official records for reasons we'll get to later. In 1297, Zafar Khan faced a Mongol army of about 20,000 soldiers at a place called Jaran Manger. The Mongols were confident. They had never lost a major battle in this region. They expected to sweep through the Indian forces, just as they had swept through everyone else. Instead, Zafar Khan destroyed them. 20,000 Mongol soldiers were dead or captured. It was a shocking defeat for an army that considered itself invincible. The next year, in 1298, the Mongols captured a fort called Sivastan in Sind. They thought they had gained a permanent foothold in Indian territory. Zafar Khan marched his army day and night, surrounded the fort, and not only defeated the Mongol garrison, but captured their commander alive and brought him back to Delhi in chains. These victories did two things. First, they proved that the Mongols could be beaten, that they weren't supernatural warriors, but men who could bleed and die like anyone else. Second, and this is important, they absolutely enraged Dewey Khan. The Chagatai ruler could not accept these defeats. His pride wouldn't allow it. More importantly, he understood that if word spread throughout Central Asia that the Mongols had been beaten by Indian forces, it would encourage resistance everywhere. The aura of Mongol invincibility, which was one of their greatest weapons, would be shattered. So, Dewey Khan made a decision. No more raids, no more limited campaigns. He was going to crush Delhi once and for all. And to lead this invasion, he chose his own son, Kutluk Khwaja, a prince of royal blood, a commander who had proven himself in battle, and a man with everything to prove. In late 1299, Kutluk Khwaja assembled his army somewhere in Central Asia. The exact size is disputed by historians. Some sources claim 200,000 cavalry, which honestly sounds like an exaggeration. More reliable estimates put the force at somewhere between 50,000 and 60,000 highly trained Mongol warriors. But even 50,000 is a terrifying number when you're talking about Mongol cavalry. Soldiers who had trained their entire lives for war, who could cover 100 miles in a day, who could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. This army began the long march south toward India. They crossed the Hindu Kush Mountains, near that brutal range that has stopped so many invaders throughout history. They came through the Khyber Pass, that narrow defile that serves as the gateway between Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent. They swept across the Punjab. And here's where things get interesting. Normally, when the Mongols invaded, they would pillage every city they passed, burning, looting, taking slaves, and loading up on supplies. But Kutluk Khwaja forbade all of that. He ordered his men to bypass the cities, to avoid attacking the fortresses, to leave the villages alone. This march took 6 months. 6 months of moving through enemy territory without taking a single city's worth of plunder. Why? Because Kutluk Khwaja wanted his army fresh and at full strength when they reached Delhi. He didn't want his soldiers weighed down with loot or exhausted from siege warfare. This was going to be a battle for everything. A single decisive confrontation that would determine the fate of India. The Mongol army would have only one target. Delhi itself, the capital, the heart of Indian resistance. The city that, if it fell, would open up the entire subcontinent to Mongol conquest. Word of the Mongol advance spread faster than the army itself. Refugees fled south, bringing tales that grew more horrific with each retelling. The Mongols numbered 1 million men. Some said they rode horses that breathed fire. They ate the flesh of children. Panic spread through northern India like wildfire. In the cities of Mulan and Samama, Alauddin's generals readied their forces, expecting the Mongols to attack them first. But Kutluk Khwaja ignored these cities completely. He had no interest in side battles. He was going straight to Delhi. And when he arrived, when his army finally stopped marching and set up camp at a place called Kili, just 10 kilometers north of Delhi's walls, the entire city held its breath. This was the moment everyone had been dreading. The Mongol Empire, the force that had conquered half the known world, was at the gates. Inside Delhi, chaos reigned. The streets were clogged with refugees from the Punjab, families who had abandoned everything to flee south. The markets were running out of food because the Mongols had cut off the trade routes. Prices were skyrocketing. The temples and mosques were overflowing with people praying for salvation. On the city walls, soldiers stared at the distant Mongol camp and wondered if they would see the next sunrise. In the palace, Alauddin Khalji faced the most important decision of his life. His generals came to him with a proposal, send an emissary to negotiate, offer tribute, buy time. Maybe the Mongols would accept payment and leave. After all, other kingdoms had survived by paying the Mongols off. But Alauddin's chief advisor, a man named Alauddin, put it more bluntly. If you fight them and lose, you die. If you hide in the city and wait for them to leave, you might survive. Choose survival. Alauddin listened to these arguments. Then he said, "No, here's what makes this moment so powerful." Alauddin was not foolish. He understood exactly what he was risking. He knew the Mongols had never lost a major campaign. He knew that if he rode out to face them in open battle, there was a very real chance he would never return. He knew that he might die on that field. But he also understood something his advisors failed to grasp. If he showed weakness now, if he hid behind Delhi's walls or paid tribute like a frightened subordinate, every noble, governor, and regional ruler from the Deccan to Bengal would see it as proof that he was weak. Within weeks, rebellions would erupt, provinces would break away, local rulers would declare independence. His empire would shatter from within, and then the Mongols wouldn't even need to conquer Delhi. It would collapse on its own. So Alauddin made his decision. He would ride out. He would face the Mongols in open battle. He would bring the full strength of Delhi's army to Kili, and he would either win or die trying. But before he left, he prepared carefully. He placed Alauddin in charge of defending Delhi itself. He gave him full control of the palace and the treasury. "Whoever wins this battle," Alauddin said, "you give them the keys. If I die, surrender the city to Kublai Khan. Do not let the people suffer through a useless siege." He also ordered the Badon Gate on the eastern side of the city to remain open. If the battle went badly, if his army was destroyed, he wanted a clear escape route toward the Doab region where he might regroup. These were not the actions of a man confident of victory. These were the actions of a man who understood he might be riding toward death, but he was going anyway. Because sometimes history reaches moments where hesitation means collapse, and courage is the only option left. Meanwhile, Kublai Khan faced his own challenges. He sent a formal message to Delhi, issuing a direct challenge. He demanded that Alauddin himself come out to fight. When Zafar Khan rode out to deliver Delhi's response, Kublai Khan refused to negotiate with him. "I did not come here to fight generals," he said. "Kings fight kings. If your sultan is afraid, tell him to send his royal standard. So I know I am fighting the true army of Delhi." It was a brilliant psychological move. By publicly questioning Alauddin's courage, Kublai Khan made it politically impossible for him to avoid battle. By demanding the royal standard, he ensured that this would be an all-or-nothing confrontation. No substitutes, no deception. The real leaders, the real armies, won decisive battle. Zafar Khan returned and reported what had happened. In the council chamber, Alauddin's advisors again urged caution. "This is a trap," they warned. "The Mongols want you in the open because that is where they are strongest. Use the walls. Force a siege." But Alauddin had already decided. The next morning, the army would march. That night, Delhi was unusually quiet. Prayers echoed from temples and mosques. Soldiers embraced their families. Wives held their husbands. Parents blessed their sons. Everyone understood that tomorrow could change everything. In the palace, Alauddin put on his armor by candlelight. He was 40 years old, at the height of his power, a man who had taken the throne through bloodshed and held it through sheer will. He had crushed rebellions, expanded his kingdom, and ruled through fear and discipline. But none of that mattered now. Tomorrow, he would face the greatest test of his life. At dawn, the gates opened. The army marched north toward Kili. The soldiers moved in near silence. Only the sound of armor, hooves, and drums broke the stillness. People climbed onto rooftops to watch them depart. Some prayed, some wept. Everyone wondered if they would ever see them again. The battlefield at Kili was mostly flat, but it had important natural features. On one side flowed the Yamuna River. On the other lay dense forest. This limited the width of the field. The Mongols, who relied on wide flanking maneuvers, would have less room to operate. It was as good a defensive position as Alauddin could hope for. When the Delhi army arrived, the Mongols were already waiting. Kutlu Khwaja had arranged his forces in classic Mongol fashion. Cavalry units stood in perfect formation. Standards fluttered. Horses stood calm and disciplined despite thousands of riders. It was a terrifying sight. Order, control, confidence. Alauddin organized his army using traditional Indian principles, modified by experience. In the center, he positioned himself with the royal guard, his most loyal troops. In front of him stood Alp Khan with 10,000 heavy cavalry tasked with absorbing the first Mongol assault. On the left flank stood Nusrat Khan, with Ulu Khan in reserve. On the right flank was Zafar Khan, commanding a mixed force that included many Hindu warriors who had proven their loyalty and knew the terrain well. Behind the cavalry stood the war elephants, massive beasts unfamiliar to most Mongols. Behind them came the infantry and archers. As the two armies faced each other, tension filled the air. The Mongols had marched for 6 months for this moment. The soldiers of Delhi knew they were standing between their homes and destruction. Every man on that field understood that the fate of northern India might be decided in the next few hours. Some thought of their families. Some thought of glory. Some thought of death. The wind carried dust across the plain. Drums began to beat. Banners fluttered. Commanders shouted orders. Horses stamped the ground. Two great armies, shaped by ambition, fear, discipline, and desperation, stood ready. And in those final moments before battle, as silence gave way to movement, history held its breath. The morning sun climbed higher as the heat of the day began to settle over the battlefield. Alauddin Khalji's strategy was clear. He needed to drag the battle out. Why? Because reinforcements were marching toward him from the eastern provinces. If he could delay the Mongols for a few days, he would gain more troops, and at the same time, the Mongols, living off the land, would face supply shortages. The longer the battle went on, the more likely they would be forced to retreat. Kutlu Khwaja, however, understood the urgency of a quick victory. He couldn't allow the battle to drag on and risk running out of momentum. So, the Mongols began probing Delhi's defenses, using small, harassing attacks designed to elicit a response. This is where things began to unravel for Alauddin. On the right flank, Zafar Khan, one of Delhi's most trusted commanders, watched as a Mongol unit under a commander named Hijlak began shooting arrows and retreating. It was a classic Mongol tactic. Fire a few arrows, then retreat, trying to bait the enemy into chasing them. Zafar Khan knew this move well. He had faced the Mongols before. He understood their tricks. But watching his men fall under the hail of arrows, his patience snapped. Without waiting for orders from Alauddin, he took matters into his own hands. "Charge," he commanded. His 5,000 cavalry, mostly Hindu warriors, surged forward with a battle cry of Har Mahadev, charging toward Hijlak's Mongol unit. Alauddin saw the movement from the center of the Delhi army. His blood ran cold. "No." Zafar Khan stopped. He shouted, but it was too late. The distance was too great, and his voice couldn't carry over the roar of the battle. For a moment, Zafar Khan's charge seemed successful. The Mongols appeared to falter, retreating as if they were on the verge of breaking. Zafar Khan's men cheered. "They're running. They're afraid. Chase them." And so they did. They pursued the Mongols across the plains, getting farther from their main defensive position. 1 kilometer, 2, 3, then the trap snapped shut. The Mongols were not retreating. They were executing a feigned retreat. Hijlak's unit had led Zafar Khan's cavalry away from their defensive formation into open ground where they were vulnerable, and as they pursued, Mongol cavalry units appeared on both flanks, charging in from all sides. Zafar Khan and his men were surrounded, cut off from the main army, trapped. Alauddin watched in horror from the center. He couldn't send reinforcements without exposing his position to attack. He couldn't abandon Zafar Khan without losing 5,000 of his best troops. He was paralyzed. Zafar Khan, realizing his catastrophic mistake, did what he could to make it count. "Form a circle," he ordered. "We die here, but we die fighting." The Mongols close in, arrows falling like rain, cavalry charges hitting them in waves. But Zafar Khan's warriors fought like men with nothing left to lose. They held their formation, even as their numbers dwindled. Zafar Khan, wielding his sword with both hands, cut through enemy after enemy. The Mongol commanders watched this desperate display of courage with a certain level of respect. These weren't soldiers fleeing. They were warriors choosing death over surrender. Kutlu Khwaja himself rode closer, seeing Zafar Khan's leadership by the way the soldiers rallied around him. The Mongol prince, impressed by Zafar Khan's bravery, made a decision. He called for a pause in the attack and rode forward under a flag of truce. "You're a brave man," Kutlu Khwaja said to Zafar Khan. "You've lost, but you fought with honor. Surrender to me, and I'll make you a general in my army. When I conquer Delhi, I'll make you sultan." But Zafar Khan refused. He would rather die than submit to the Mongols, and the battle continued until there was nothing left but the sound of dying men and the chaos of a lost army. It was a generous offer by the standards of the time. Zafar Khan could have saved himself, claimed power and wealth. All he had to do was betray his sultan. But Zafar Khan looked at Kutlu Khwaja, then at his men, bloodied, exhausted, but still standing, and smiled. "I serve Alauddin Khalji," he declared. "I live for him, or I die for him. There is nothing else to discuss." With that, he raised his sword and charged. The Mongols resumed their attack. According to the historian Isami, writing years later, Zafar Khan killed 5,000 Mongol soldiers before finally falling. While that number is certainly an exaggeration, no single warrior could kill that many in a battle. The fact that the story claimed 5,000 speaks volumes about how fiercely Zafar Khan fought in those final moments. He didn't just die, he became a legend, choosing honor over survival. However, Zafar Khan did achieve one crucial thing before he perished. In one of his final charges, he managed to wound Kutlu Khwaja. Sources are unclear about whether it was a sword or a spear, but it was a deep wound to the Mongol prince's shoulder. Kutlu Khwaja was pulled back by his men, who began emergency treatment, and while the prince survived, he was badly hurt. That single injury would ultimately decide the fate of the entire battle. With Zafar Khan's force destroyed, the Mongols turned their attention to the main Delhi army. Now came the real test. The full weight of the Mongol cavalry crashed into the center of Alauddin's army. War elephants trumpeted in charge, their tusks fitted with blades, and archers shooting down at the Mongol ranks. Horses reared in terror at the sight of these massive beasts, something the Mongols had encountered before, but never in such numbers. The Delhi heavy cavalry, encased in armor, formed a wall around their sultan. The battle raged for hours. Akat Khan, commanding the front line, held his position even as he died. Nusrat Khan and Aluk Khan, on the flanks, counterattacked Mongol probes, keeping the line intact. Alauddin himself fought, his sword red with blood, inspiring his men by his mere presence. The Mongols were beginning to realize something they had rarely faced. They couldn't break this army. The Delhi soldiers weren't running or panicking. They were holding their ground with stubborn determination born of desperation. As the sun began to set on the first day, both sides pulled back, exhausted. Thousands were dead, and the wounded covered the battlefield, crying out for water, help, or for the end of their pain. That night, Alauddin's surviving generals gathered around him and urgently suggested retreat. We've lost Zafar Khan, Akat Khan, and thousands of our best soldiers. We must fall back to Delhi, use the walls, and make them siege us. It's our only chance. Alauddin listened to them, then spoke quietly but with absolute conviction. If I move, it will only be forward. Tomorrow we fight again. In the Mongol camp, Kutlu Khwaja lay on a cot, fever setting in as his wound became infected. His generals gathered around him, urging retreat until he recovered, but Kutlu Khwaja refused. We fight tomorrow, he said. We're too close to victory to stop now. And so both armies, battered and bleeding, settled in for a long night. Fires burned across both camps, and soldiers tried to sleep, but the cries of the wounded kept them awake. Everyone knew that tomorrow would bring more death. The second day of battle was different. While there were small skirmishes and probing attacks, neither side launched a major engagement. Both armies seemed to be waiting. Alauddin was waiting for reinforcements from the east, while Kutlu Khwaja waited for his fever to break and his strength to return. The third day was even quieter. It was eerie, unsettling. Two massive armies sat less than a mile apart, watching each other but not fighting. In the Mongol camp, Kutlu Khwaja's condition worsened. The wound was badly infected, and poison was spreading through his blood. He was barely conscious, drifting in and out of fever delirium. His generals convened an emergency council. The prince was dying, and without proper treatment, he would be dead within weeks. The 6-month march had depleted their supplies, and the local villages had hidden or fled with food. Delhi's reinforcements were drawing closer each day. For the first time in 70 years, a Mongol army considered retreat. On the night of the third day, under the cover of darkness, the Mongol army began its quiet retreat. They made no announcements, sent no heralds, and left without a sound. The army packed up its camp, mounted their horses, and rode north. It was done so efficiently, so professionally, that the Delhi scouts didn't realize it until dawn. When the sun rose on the fourth day, the Delhi soldiers looked out across the battlefield, only to see empty ground. The Mongols were gone. For a moment, confusion reigned, but then someone shouted, "They've left! We've won!" The victory cry quickly spread through the army. Soldiers cheered, embraced, and wept with relief. They had survived. Delhi had survived. The Mongols, once unstoppable, had been stopped. But when the news reached Alauddin, sitting in his tent and staring at a map, he didn't smile or celebrate. He looked north toward the retreating dust clouds and quietly said, "They'll be back." He was both right and wrong. The Mongols would return, but they would never again come so close to conquering Delhi. Now, here's where the story takes a tragic turn, highlighting how complicated history can be and how often those who save nations get forgotten, while those who give orders take all the credit. Let's talk about Zafar Khan, the general who charged into the Mongol trap, fought to the death, and wounded the Mongol prince, arguably saving Delhi by doing so. You might think he would be remembered as a national hero. You would think there would be statues of him, school children learning his name, historians writing books about his last stand. But you would be wrong. When Alauddin returned to Delhi, he wasn't grateful. He was furious. Zafar Khan had disobeyed orders. He had attacked without permission, endangering the entire battle plan by breaking formation. Yes, his sacrifice had turned out to be crucial, and without him wounding Kutlu Khwaja, the Mongols might have won. But Alauddin didn't see it that way. To him, disobedience, even heroic disobedience, could not be tolerated. If one general ignored orders and was praised, then discipline in the army would collapse. Alauddin made a decision that I find both understandable from a military standpoint and absolutely tragic from a human one. He ordered Zafar Khan's name to be erased from history. The court historian Amir Khusro wrote a chronicle called Kazan Futu that detailed all of Alauddin's military campaigns. It talked about the Battle of Kili, praising the Sultan's brilliance and describing the Mongol retreat. But Zafar Khan wasn't mentioned. Not once. It was as if he had never existed. Other chronicles from Alauddin's lifetime similarly omit him, or reduce him to a mere footnote. It wasn't until historians writing after Alauddin's death that Zafar Khan's heroism was recorded. Historians like Isami, writing decades later, preserved the tale of his courage. But by then, the damage was done. Zafar Khan had been forgotten by the people he had saved. He had given everything, and his reward was to be erased from history because he made his sultan look bad. This is profoundly unfair. Zafar Khan died protecting his city, but his name was wiped from the official records. Alauddin wasn't wrong in maintaining discipline. Without it, an army becomes a mob. But there has to be room for recognizing extraordinary courage, even when it comes with disobedience. Zafar Khan deserved better. Meanwhile, Kutlu Khwaja and his army were on their way back to Central Asia. The Mongol prince's condition worsened. The wound Zafar Khan had inflicted was killing him slowly. Medieval medicine had no antibiotics, no proper surgical techniques, just hope and prayer, and usually death. Kutlu Khwaja likely died somewhere in what is now Afghanistan or Pakistan. His body was eventually returned to his father, Dua Khan, and when Dua Khan learned that his son was dead and the invasion had failed, he reportedly went into a rage. But he also learned a valuable lesson. India wasn't going to be easy to conquer. The Delhi Sultanate had strong leadership, a powerful army, and the will to fight. This wouldn't be like conquering China or Persia, where one decisive victory could break the resistance. This would be a long and brutal campaign with no guarantee of success. But the Mongols, ever persistent, tried again. In 1303, just 4 years after the Battle of Kili, another Mongol army invaded. This time, they reached Delhi and laid siege to the city for 2 months. Inside the walls of Delhi, Alauddin and his court waited. Food supplies ran low, disease spread, and panic began to take root. But Alauddin held firm. He knew that the Mongols couldn't maintain a siege indefinitely. His decision to hold out for reinforcements, his preparations for defense, and his leadership in this desperate time kept the Mongols at bay for a long while. The Mongols had no supply base in India. They were relying on the land itself, which meant they would run out of food before Delhi did. And that's exactly what happened. After 2 months, the Mongol army retreated, accomplishing nothing except wasting time and losing men. In 1305, Alauddin sent his general Malakafar to confront another Mongol invasion at Amroha. The battle was a decisive victory for Delhi, with 8,000 Mongol soldiers killed. The survivors fled back across the border. The following year, another Mongol force was defeated at the Ravi River by Delhi's armies. After that, the Mongols stopped trying. They continued with occasional raids, but the days of large-scale invasions trying to conquer India were over. But why? What changed? The answer is fairly simple. The Mongols had built their empire on a reputation for invincibility. When they arrived at your gates, you only had 2 choices: surrender immediately and become a vassal state, or resist and face total destruction. In most places, people chose surrender because they had heard the stories. They knew what happened to cities that resisted. But Delhi had fought back, and won, not just once, but multiple times. Each time the Mongols failed, their reputation took a hit. Word spread. If Delhi could beat them, maybe others could too. The aura of invincibility was gone, and without that psychological weapon, the Mongols were just another army, skilled and dangerous, yes, but not unbeatable. Let's take a moment to consider why the Mongols failed in India when they succeeded almost everywhere else. First, leadership. Alauddin was a genuinely brilliant military commander. He understood logistics, strategy, and the importance of maintaining a professional army. He didn't rely on feudal levies or poorly trained soldiers. Alauddin created a war machine specifically designed to fight the Mongols, and it worked. Second, military reforms. Alauddin's innovations, like the dog and Julia systems, might seem minor, but they made a huge difference. These reforms ensured that soldiers were well-trained and properly equipped, allowing Delhi's army to match the Mongols in combat. Third, strategic defense. Alauddin didn't try to conquer Central Asia or overextend his reach. He built a network of fortresses along the northwest frontier, focusing on defense rather than expansion. He understood that he didn't need to destroy the Mongol Empire. He just needed to make India a costly prize that wasn't worth the effort. Fourth, adaptation. Delhi's armies learned from the Mongols. They adopted some of their cavalry tactics, studied their strategies, and found ways to counter their famous feigned retreat. But I think there's something else at play, something harder to quantify. The people of Delhi, from the Sultan down to the common soldiers, everyone knew that they weren't just fighting for land or treasure, they were fighting for their survival. When the Mongols invaded China or Persia, people might have thought, maybe the new rulers will be better. Maybe we can keep our heads down and life will go on. But in Delhi, everyone understood that Mongol rule meant destruction, slaughter, the end of their civilization. This gave them a desperation and determination that the Mongols hadn't encountered elsewhere. And that made all the difference. You can have the best tactics in the world, but if your enemy is willing to die rather than surrender, if they'll hold their ground no matter the cost, eventually superior courage can overcome superior skill. Now, I want to ask you something. Drop your answer in the comments below, because I genuinely want to know your thoughts. Why is it that we remember the Mongol Empire as this unstoppable force, and rightly so, they changed the world, but we tend to remember the conquerors more than the people who stopped them? Why is Genghis Khan so famous, but not Alauddin Khalji? Why do most people know about the Mongol invasions of Europe, but have never heard of the Battle of Kili? Is it because we're drawn to stories of victory and conquest rather than defense and survival? Or is it something else? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because it's something I think about a lot when studying history. The legacy of the Battle of Kili extended far beyond just stopping one invasion. Alauddin's victory gave him the breathing room to consolidate his empire. He went on to conquer large parts of southern India, expanding the Delhi Sultanate to its greatest extent. He reformed the economy, controlled inflation, and created a period of relative stability that lasted for years. None of that would have been possible if the Mongols had won at Kili. Delhi would have been destroyed, the Sultanate would have collapsed, and the entire history of India would have been different. The geopolitical situation of the medieval world could have been radically different had a few decisions gone another way. Yet, that's not what happened. One battle, one sultan's choice to leave the safety of his fortress and confront the enemy head-on, rather than hide behind the high walls. One general's decision to defy orders and charge into the fray, a move that led to his death but also wounded the enemy prince. One army's refusal to break ranks, despite the overwhelming odds, dramatically altered the course of history, and in a tragic yet poignant way. I find that beautiful. History is inevitable. It isn't preordained. Instead, it's the result of decisions made by real people, often in impossible circumstances. People who were terrified and uncertain, but still did what they believed was right, regardless of the consequences. Alauddin, often seen as a brutal dictator who slaughtered his way to power, made one of the most critical choices in history when he refused to surrender to the Mongols. His decision saved countless lives, not just in Delhi but across the region. Zafar Khan, a general under his command, disobeyed orders and paid the ultimate price for it. His reckless act of bravery, which led to his death, also wounded the Mongol commander Kutluk Khwaja, potentially saving the city of Delhi. These moments tell us how complicated history is, and how the people who shaped it were themselves far from simple. They were driven by ambition, fear, and duty, sometimes acting with wisdom, and sometimes in desperation. And that is exactly what makes history so fascinating to study. It's messy, unpredictable, and filled with contradictions. Before we move on, let me share something that may help you understand this entire story in a more meaningful light. If we look at the legacy of Genghis Khan today, we see two entirely different perspectives on him, depending on where you're standing. In Central Asia, the lands that were once part of the Mongol Empire, Genghis Khan is revered as a hero. He's celebrated as a founding father who united the various tribes and built the largest contiguous empire in history. From their viewpoint, Genghis Khan was indeed a great leader. He brought order to chaos, and his leadership forged a lasting empire. But in the Middle East, particularly in places like Iraq and Iran, Genghis Khan is seen as a monster, a destroyer. He razed cities to the ground, slaughtered millions of people, and spread terror wherever he went. To these people, Genghis Khan represents the very definition of ruthless conquest and tyranny. And again, that viewpoint is equally valid based on the history that unfolded in those regions. Then, if we turn our focus to India, especially in Delhi, we find that there are still monuments and historical records that remember Alauddin Khalji as the man who single-handedly saved India from a Mongol onslaught. For many in Delhi, Alauddin is seen as a hero who stood firm in the face of unimaginable odds. The same events, fought and endured by the same people, are interpreted in entirely different ways depending on where one stands. This should teach us an important lesson about perspective and how the stories we tell ourselves shape how we view the world around us. So, what can we take away from the Battle of Kili in 2024, more than 700 years later? I believe there are several key lessons that still resonate with us today. First, reputation is not the same as reality. The Mongols were feared across the world, and they had earned a reputation for being unbeatable. That reputation often did more damage than their actual conquests. For years, their enemies were already intimidated by the idea of facing them, which made it easier for the Mongols to win battles without even having to fight hard. But when someone like Alauddin stood up to them and fought back effectively, that invincible reputation crumbled. In your own life, it's important not to be intimidated by the reputation of a challenge. If you're facing something difficult, don't let the fear of it stop you from even trying. Challenges, like the Mongol invasion, may seem insurmountable at first, but with the right mindset, you can overcome them. The second lesson is that preparation is essential. Alauddin didn't just get lucky. He spent years building up his military, fortifying his offenses, and training his soldiers to fight with discipline and resilience. By the time the Mongol army arrived at Delhi's gates, Alauddin and his forces were ready. He had spent the time and effort necessary to prepare for the worst, and when that moment came, he was able to meet it with strength. In your own life, this lesson is vital. Whatever challenges you face, be it career goals, personal growth, or any significant change, the more prepared you are, the more likely you are to succeed. Don't expect success to come overnight or by accident. It requires hard work, training, and the ability to adapt when things don't go as planned. Third, sometimes the right decision is the hardest decision. Alauddin could have taken the easier route. He could have negotiated with the Mongols, paid tribute to them, or even sought a truce. And far less risky than going to battle. But Alauddin understood that in the long run, that kind of compromise would have meant the downfall of his empire. Instead, he made the difficult choice to engage in battle, a decision that could have ended in defeat, but ultimately led to victory. In life, you may often face situations where the right path is the most challenging one. Whether it's standing up for what you believe in, making sacrifices, or taking a leap of faith, these are not easy decisions. But they are often the ones that make the most profound impact on your future. And finally, we learn that heroes don't always get remembered but their deeds live on. Zafar Khan's heroic act of defiance saved Delhi, yet he was erased from official records and forgotten by history for a long time. However, history has a way of revealing the truth, and decades later, historians started acknowledging his contribution. Centuries later, we still remember him and honor his sacrifice. If you ever do something brave or meaningful, even if it doesn't earn you recognition at the time, don't worry. The truth has a way of surviving. Even if those in power try to erase you, your actions can still make a lasting impact. Time has a way of preserving the legacy of those who make a difference, even if it takes years or even centuries for the world to remember them. Now, we've covered a lot of ground in this story. From the rise of the Mongol Empire to the streets of Delhi in 1299, from Zafar Khan's deceptive retreat to the mysterious withdrawal of the Mongol forces, from the forgotten hero's sacrifice to the lasting legacy of that day. If you made it this far, I want to thank you. I know this was a lengthy journey, but I want to make sure this incredible story got the attention it deserved. If you enjoyed this deep dive into a battle that most people have never heard of, but that changed the course of history, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We got many more stories like this, forgotten battles, overlooked heroes, and moments that shape the world we live in today. And seriously, leave a comment below. What do you think about Alauddin Khalji? Was he a hero who saved India, or a tyrant who just happened to fend off an invasion? What about Zafar Khan? Does his disobedience make his sacrifice more meaningful or less? I want to know what you think. Here's what I want you to do next. Share this video. I mean it. This story deserves to be heard. Zafar Khan deserves to be remembered. The Battle of Kili should be placed alongside other legendary battles like Thermopylae, where determined defense changed the course of history. So, share this video with a friend who loves history. Post it on your social media. Help spread the word about the day Delhi stood up to the Mongols and won. Because if we don't tell these stories, if we don't honor these moments, they might be lost forever. And that would be a tragedy. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. And remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding who we are and how we got here. Every battle, every decision, every forgotten hero contributed to the world we live in today. Never forget that.